All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Ateneo de Manila University Department of Economics and Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development Seminar Series. For those of you who have joined us just this morning for this seminar series, we hope that you enjoyed our little virtual tour of the university. And as we open more and more classes and they are being conducted face-to-face, we hope that maybe next year we can all welcome you at the university. Okay, but today, before we begin our seminar, let me just give you our house rules. We will let the speaker finish his presentation first before we entertain questions. Zoom participants, kindly stay muted and stop sharing your video during the duration of the presentation, except of course our speaker. During Q&A, please virtually raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged. You may unmute and show yourself when asking your questions. Please also let us know your institutional affiliation before asking your questions. The same on the participants on Facebook. You may post your questions in the comment sections and we will read them out for you. Slide videos and other materials from the seminar are posted on our website and also in Ateneo YouTube channel only when the speaker gives his consent for sharing them. Okay, so this morning, we have Thomas Kemp, Professor Thomas Kemp, who is chair and professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire, as our speaker. He has previously worked at the Department of Transport Abu Dhabi, the City of Eau Claire, and Denver University. He has also served on the Eau Claire Redevelopment Authority. He currently teaches applied research methods, international trade and finance, the history of economic thought, and macroeconomics. His ongoing research interests include hedonic modeling, local economic development and transportation policy, and public policy design. He has authored dozens of policy papers related to the above topics. His academic work has been published in a variety of journals, including the Appraisal Journal, Journal of Economic Issues, Review of Social Economy, and the Forum for Social Economics. He authored the books Progress and Reform, The Economic Thought of John R. Commons, and Basic Macroeconomics. And next year, he will also be joining the Department of Economics as an affiliate faculty. In his spare time, Tom enjoys spending time with his family, wasting money and time, riding and repairing old Lambretta and Vespa motor scooters, and creating too much noise playing the guitar. Maybe we will hear him later play the guitar. So please welcome, we have here Professor Thomas Kemp, who is here with us to present his work on integrating applied fieldwork into the undergraduate economics curriculum. So Tom, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Maha, for that generous introduction, and thank you to all the students, faculty, and staff of the Ateneo Department of Economics for having me here today. It's a lot of people's very valuable time, and I appreciate it. So thank you. I'm honored. You know, when I was asked to give this talk some time ago, I thought about it for a while. You know, so what kind of value I could provide for you all. You know, a lot of my research, you know, technical research is really in local economic issues or even regional economic issues. And in this part of the world, on the other side of the world. And so I thought that, you know, you might not really be interested in the value of Wisconsin lakes or things like that. But I thought, you know, we're all economists. We've all devoted a significant portion of our lives to the study of this field. And it's something that of course I think about quite a bit too. And you know, why we do what we do, what are some of the challenges in what we do, and what are some things that we might be able to do a little differently, and how might we be able to do those things together. And so this is a little bit the story of some of my side thoughts and research over the last decade or so. This all started out, as I say, about a decade ago. I was teaching first-year macroeconomics at the time, and it was getting near the end of the term. So these are college freshmen. It's getting near the end of the term, and we were talking about current events, something it was probably during the Great Recession, in fact. And I realized my students had no idea what GDP was. They knew what GDP was. They knew how it's the sum of the four categories: C, household consumption, investment, government, net export spend. They had no idea what the number was. They couldn't tell you whether it was 2 trillion or 100 trillion or whatever. And I took some probing questions to that and found out that they didn't really have very much knowledge of the data associated with economics at all. And so this sort of started me on this mission of kind of thinking about, boy, that's really important. And how do we bring that into the economics classroom? And so that was where we started. And then this presentation is sort of the story of where I've gone in the last 12 years with that. So it's a summary of a lot of different projects, really. So we can hop on to the next slide. So in this presentation, I've sort of subdivided it into these areas. The first area, we're going to talk a little bit about the landscape of economics education. And this will be familiar, I think, to everybody. But I want to set the stage for sort of, what we do in the undergraduate classroom, where it comes from, and why we do it. Once that I'm through that, I'm going to move to the second stage here, which is I'm going to present what I believe to be a reasonable rationale for really a more empirical and applied economics education. So, we'll get to that in due course. And then third, I'll talk about some examples of a scaffolded educational experience, and I'll very particular on that about a scaffolded educational experience. And then finally, I'll conclude with a little bit of thoughts on where I'd like to take this, what are sort of the next directions. And it's really my hope that maybe these are some things that we can work together on moving forward. So let's move on to the next slide then. So in the first part of economics, we obviously subdivided into microeconomics and macroeconomics. Oftentimes students start with microeconomics because it's perhaps the older. If we pick up any microeconomics textbook, or nearly every microeconomics textbook that a first-year student is faced with, it really owes its origins to this one right here. That's Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics. And first printing is 1890, so about 130 years ago. It's in that book that we see really the formalization of supply and demand functions, the ideas of market forces driving prices to, perfectly competitive results, the idea of partial equilibrium, constrained maximization, so on and so forth, the profit maximizing behavior of firms in competitive markets. And we also see something that we don't see in most modern microeconomics textbooks, and that's a heavy emphasis on history and institutions. Where did those markets come from? Why do firms historically behave that way? What is the legal environment in which firms operate? So on and so forth. And a lot of that's kind of disappeared throughout the 20th century. So sort of keep that thought in mind. I'll come back to it. Some of my colleagues here joke that you could teach Marshall's textbook today, right? That pretty much everything in modern microeconomics was in Marshall's textbook. Let's hop over to the next slide then. Okay, so here's sort of the stuff we see in a microeconomics textbook, right? You got a supply curve, you got a demand curve, there's some kind of shift, right? You got your firm cost functions over there on the right. Students are taught, that the perfectly competitive firm operates at the minimum of the average cost function, right? That average cost function is tangent to the demand function, and all of this operates on the upward sloping portion of the marginal cost function, and so on and so forth. What we generally don't do, at least in the United States, we generally don't do is we don't apply any actual data to either of these problems, either to supply and demand or to firm cost functions. Sometimes textbooks will utilize some contrived data that fits the shapes of the functions as we would like to sort of see them. But I, for one, have never seen a business present its accounts as variable costs and fixed costs. Generally, they talk in operating expenditures and capital expenditures, and their accounting procedures really don't look much like what we do in economics. So hold that thought, and we'll grab to the next slide. So moving forward a couple generations, we get sort of the beginning of macroeconomics, and pretty much everything we see in a modern macroeconomics textbook owes its roots to this one. This is Paul Samuelson's 1946 first printing, Foundations of Economic Analysis. And so it's in here, we get what we call Keynesian macroeconomics. Of course, Keynes's general theory had come out 10 years ahead of this, but Paul Samuelson is really the one who lays out Keynes's framework and puts it into a textbook format for undergraduates to understand. He also brings in a lot of Marshall's microeconomics into this textbook and presents it in a more graphical way. We also find circular flow diagrams presented here. We find the notion of general market equilibrium, business cycle theory, and not in this first draft, but later on, we see ISLM and ASAD models. So investment savings, liquidity money, aggregate supply, aggregate demand models. So there was all the sort of meat and potatoes of your standard macroeconomic course. Next slide, please. So here we see sort of that sort of meat and potatoes, right? Your aggregate supply, aggregate demand, long run and short run on the left, and then Keynesian style general equilibrium on the right. Again, not a lot of data applied to any of these models, particularly at the undergraduate level, but even at the graduate level, data, at least in the States, is usually fairly contrived data, if at all. Generally, these results are derived algebraically and then left as they are. This was a sort of second step that was concerning to me. Around the same time, I was also teaching more advanced macroeconomic theory. And of course, all my students had learned about aggregate supply and aggregate demand in the freshman class. And I asked them, where does aggregate supply come from? And not a single one of them could tell me. Not a single one of them could tell me why the aggregate supply, the aggregate supply curve slopes upward, or what would determine its elasticity, even if it sloped upwards. And this is a concern, right? This is a concern. They understand that, okay, if the monetary policy becomes looser, the aggregate demand shifts to the right. If it becomes tighter, it shifts to the left, so on and so forth. Fiscal policy, they can do all these kind of operations, but understanding the mechanism underneath the models was lacking. Next slide, please. Now, I don't mean to sort of be putting all this down, right? We've all spent a lot of our time working on these things, and they have great value. What is that value? What is the value to a series of sort of formalized models to which we don't really apply data to, but yet we come to some pretty profound results? Well, it provides clarity of concept. So we're able to convey a large number of important micro and macroeconomic ideas to students in a short period of time. Furthermore, we're able to construct a set of heuristics by which students, and of course, practitioners of economics, are able to arrive at a wide variety of applied policy situations in short order. So, for example, with inflation running relatively high in the United States, any student of economics should understand that the central bank is likely to raise interest rates in an effort to reduce investment spending, and as a consequence, to cool goods markets, thereby reducing the amount of inflation in the economy. Okay, so there's actually quite a bit behind that, right? But that simple heuristic is understandable, relatable, and usable in a wide variety of environments. Other examples is any first-year student of economics can say that, well, if more people want a thing, by and large, its price is likely to go up. These are useful things. Okay, these are useful things, And they're very good ways to think about a lot of problems in a data poor or high computational cost environment where institutions are well established and not in flux. So if we don't have data, or we don't have the time for the data, or our audience simply isn't interested in that level of detail, those heuristics are extremely useful. If we can assume that the legal environment, the institutions of the society, and I've defined institutions here, are well established and can be assured to stay that way over a long period of time, then these heuristics are extremely useful. They can give us a lot of answers to a lot of questions in a very short period of time. So that gets us to this idea that what are we teaching them? What are we teaching students, or what are we doing when we're doing rudimentary economics? Well, Greg Mankiw's book, which is the dominant textbook today, speaks about the economic way of thinking. And I have some differences with Dr. Mankiw about the economic way of thinking, but I think he's certainly right in that that's what we're teaching them. We're teaching students how to think like economists, how to think through problems the way an economist would. And I think we would all agree that there's a lot of value in that. That said, next slide, please. A few years after these stories that I'm relating, I was given the good fortune to take over as internship director of my department. So I was responsible for finding students internships, helping them prepare their resumes to go out into the working environment. And lo and behold, students would tell me, I have no idea what I learned as an economist. What do I put on my resume? This is concerning. They couldn't give a list of specific skills that they'd learned. They couldn't tell me what type of jobs they should even apply for. They were looking for jobs labeled economist, and with an undergraduate education, at least in the US, that's not the type of jobs you're looking for. They had no portfolio of work which to offer to employers as evidence of the work they've done. And this was concerning to me. I think as educators, I personally feel it very important that a big part of our job is to prepare our students for the next stages of their life. And so I was troubled by this. I was troubled by students not being able to answer these questions. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on to the second part of the presentation then, sort of my case for what to sort of do about this. Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand that I do not believe in sort of throwing out. We have a phrase in the States said throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I don't think that exists anywhere else. It's kind of not a good phrase, but what it means is, the bathwater, when it's done, you get rid of it, right? But for sure, you don't want to get rid of the baby in the bath. And I think that goes with a lot of what we do in economics, right? So a lot of the good things that we do in economics, we don't want to lose, right? We don't need to upend curriculum. We don't need to upend everything we do. But I do think that sort of a thoughtful approach, or at least I've tried to apply a more thoughtful approach to how I do things, right? Recognizing that we don't live in a data poor environment. I'm kind of an old guy at this point. Boy, my students, when I write a complicated equation on the board these days or something like that, boy, they're out there with their phones. They take snapshots of it. When I'm doing something in an econometrics class, right, they grab snapshots, and they're instantaneously grabbing data in the classroom, right? So it's not the world of 30 years ago. It's a world where, if anything, we have too much data. Computational costs have fallen tremendously and are likely to continue to fall in the near future, right? So problems that when I was taught econometrics in the 1990s, we did these things by hand in many cases, and that's just ridiculous today, right? Nobody does that way anymore. Computational costs have fallen tremendously. And the second thing, or third thing rather, that's occurred is I think we all, certainly in the States at any rate, we live in an environment where we're recognizing that institutional diversity is a real thing, right? So the institutions that we sort of all live in a society aren't necessarily the same across even a nation state or even a region of a country, and that those things are fairly in flux at this point. After all, I'm speaking to you from the other side of the world. Of course, we wouldn't be doing this probably if it wasn't COVID, but I'm speaking to you from the other side of the world. This in and of itself was not possible, 10 years ago. So, how do we incorporate those changes into economics? In the first section of this presentation, I made the argument that, most of what we do in first year economics, and indeed undergraduate economics in general, is derived from this era of the mid 20th century or earlier. This is a totally different environment in terms of quality of data, availability of data, computational cost, as well as a very limited recognition of institutional diversity. So how do we bring these modern possibilities into the economics curriculum? Oh, by the way, that computer there, that was my first computer. So that's why I put it in there. Next slide, please. Okay, so as a profession, of course, and we've seen that in some of the other presentations here, this term economics has seen tremendous growth and improvement in empirical methods. The empirical methods that we utilize in economics today were almost unthinkable 20 years ago. And again, keeping in mind that those textbooks are not from 20 years ago by and large with the materials, they're from 80 to 100 years ago. There's been tremendous growth in empirical methods. There's been a growing recognition of the importance of institutions and human experiences. And I think that, at least again in the States here, there's become increasing recognition of the value in being able to collaborate across fields of inquiry. So we think of economics, right? But economics lies within a broad spectrum of social sciences. And those social sciences also lie on a spectrum from the humanities to the more natural sciences and other technical fields. And our ability to communicate across those fields is greatly facilitated by modern empirical methods. It's greatly facilitated by a rich set of data that's available to us all now for very, very low costs. And it also brings theoretical strength in the sense that the models and methods that these other fields that I've listed here today are often trying to solve the same problems that we're trying to solve as economists, but they're bringing a different perspective to it. Okay. Next slide, please. Now, in this third part of this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done in trying to do this. I've been very surprised by the lack of literature in economics on the idea that we would bring empirics, that we would bring field work, that we would bring applied experiences into the undergraduate classroom. They're actually quite rare in economics. And indeed, the three papers I have cited here are not in economics. They are in natural sciences and in the medical fields, where these things are commonplace. An undergraduate education in the medical fields without applied experiences would be a deficient experience. But in economics, it's very rare to do that. And I understand there are significant challenges to doing that, and I've experienced them, and I'm hoping that we can have a bit of a lively discussion afterwards about how we might do that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so when I started bringing applied work into the economics classroom, I started at the upper division, which maybe where we would think students would have a good idea how to sort of apply their economic ideas. But I found that that was a big problem. And it was a big problem because students didn't necessarily have the quality of spreadsheet management skills. They didn't have the knowledge of how to utilize statistical packages. They were not super familiar with utilizing data clearinghouse websites like the FRED site or the BEA, or of course you have the PSA, the Philippine Statistical Authority in the Philippines. And so as a consequence, we spent a lot of time sort of with these sort of basics of data acquisition and data management. And so what I started doing then is in the first year courses at the undergraduate level, started introducing how you do these sort of things to students. So I'll talk about that pre-introductory thing in just a moment, if you'll forgive me. In the first year classes, we start gathering data. So when I use in here in the States, I use the FRED site, which we can talk about a little bit later, as well as the Bureau of Economic Analysis, as well as the Census and the USDA. Those are the primary sources I used for first year students to get them used to looking at data, grabbing data, pulling down data, bringing it into the spreadsheets, doing visualization, so graphing, as well as other data visualization techniques. That then prepares them for the advanced undergraduate level to start thinking about utilizing econometric methods, not just as a series of sort of contrived procedures that they might do in a first year econometrics class, but actually using real data sets, right, from past studies that I've done or my colleagues have done on real problems. And I find that this really facilitates, they like it, right? Students get excited to be working on what they perceive to be actual problems. We get them thinking about research design and methods, and where possible, I try to get these students out in the field and actually working with the community on actual economic problems. And that seems to work pretty good. Now, I'm going to return to that first point here because that's sort of a new step. Another challenge that I've found, right, is that basic coding skills and related data management skills are also fairly lacking. And I'll be honest, I'm not an expert in that area. So I'm working now to also integrate. I've been working with our computer science department and our information systems departments to construct a introductory first year course, a 1-credit course that introduces students to basic coding and data management. So it's sort of got 3 tiers here at the undergraduate level, which we're trying to get students involved in doing this sort of work. Let's hop to the next slide. And I have to thank my slide helper too. This is really great. Usually I have to manage all my own slides, and it's really nice to just be able to say next slide. So thank you very much. Okay, now all of this, of course, can't really proceed without a plan. So when we're talking again about economics principles classes, we're mapping those to course outcomes. So what are the outcomes that students are supposed to achieve in a first year economics course? What are they supposed to achieve in an advanced undergraduate course? We don't want to throw things out, that valuable things that our students are already learning, to try to cram these new things in, because as I mentioned, those sort of basic heuristics that economists apply to a variety of problems are absolutely critical to the work of doing economics, right, of being an economist. So we want to be considering when we're doing each of these exercises or I want to be considering, I should say, what are we trying to achieve with each particular activity? So for example, if I'm having a first year student pull down GDP data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, I'm going to bring that right into the idea of, okay, identify what is household consumption, identify what business investment is, identify government spending, identify foreign sector, so on and so forth. Because I want them to be able to take those numbers, and then I want them to apply it to that aggregate demand function and understand that that function that they're drawing then tells us about the responsiveness of certain types of those pieces of data to different economic situations. When we're in the advanced undergraduate class, again, we want to map those to the course. We want to map those to the course outcomes. What are the students supposed to be learning in those courses? What are we trying to teach them? What are we trying to do to prepare them for the next steps as economists? And in that case, we're talking about case studies, right? We're talking about independent and team research. We're talking about field studies, again, where possible. Field studies, I think, are a real challenge. Well, I'll talk about that in due course. Hey, get the next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned a few examples. Here are some of the organizations that I use that have really great data at them, and I've also included the PSA there. I spent the last couple of weeks poking around at the PSA's website, and they've got, they have a lot of really good data about what's going on in the Philippines. I'm sure everybody, I'm telling you, right, you're all like, yes, we know this, of course. But it was fun for me to see this, right? It's fun for me to see that this is sort of a new thing. And I will likely include that in my international trade class and have them utilize some data from the PSA as well as these other places. But students I like to ask, or excuse me, questions I like to ask my students include things like this, what is the GDP of the United States? And again, surprising how few sort of know that, right? And okay, well, how can we find that out? Okay, usually students will just Google it, right, and get a number. So, okay, no, let's get the actual numbers and show them how to do it. Okay, Philippines, what's the GDP of the Philippines? What is per capita GDP of the Philippines? What is the demand elasticity of tobacco? What about rice? Those are very fundamental questions that are extremely important, right? Because if the demand elasticity of one of these is inelastic versus elastic, it has very different implications in terms of tax policy. It has very different implications in terms of any kind of restraint of trade. It has very different implications about the likely structure of the industry in question, and so on and so forth. And so it's important to sort of be thinking about, I think, what these elasticities are, what these numbers are, in addition to sort of just being able to draw the functions. I also, particularly in the trade class, but in other classes, what are the major imports of a country? What are the major imports of the United States? What are the major exports? I find that these things are really not very well known, and it's always surprising to me. And I think that students like to know what they are. Particularly in the United States, we spent a lot of time, worrying about our lack of manufacturing. And a quick review of the manufacturing data at the Bureau of Labor Statistics or at the BEA will show you that the value of US manufacturing is higher than it is at any stage in US history. And that runs strongly counter to what students have generally heard. There's fewer jobs, but there's more value and output. And I think those stories are very valuable to our students. I think those stories really help them to grab on to the theoretical ideas that they're being presented with. Can they explain those ideas to a layperson? Can they construct graphical representations of each of these from the data and incorporate it into their explanations? These, I think, are very useful skills, at least that I've found help my students to be more involved in the classroom and be more involved in their learning experience. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I think this one speaks for itself, so we'll just move on to the next slide after that. And plus I'm running out of time, honestly, here. Okay, so these are these are 3 examples of projects that I did in the last couple of years with our students, and it really what I want to talk about the most in the last 10 minutes. I've got some details of the second and third ones here, but the one on the left, Buffalo County, this was a project that we did. So I took a class of advanced undergraduates, 20 students, and we were asked by one of the local counties, it's like province, rural province, about an hour distance from where I live. And this county is losing population, and they're seeing economic decline as a result of that, as well as some other reasons. And so I was approached by some of the community leaders there to try to do a study of what they could do to turn things around. And so I asked this group of students, could we work on this term? And that it became the entire class in our project. We employed a variety of methods to analyze the economy. We benchmarked that economy against similar economies. We then identified, by speaking with members of the community, specific economic goals that they would like to achieve. We then attempted to develop policies and tools that we believed would be likely for them to achieve these goals if implemented. We presented these results to the community leaders after roughly 4 months' time. And I'm happy to say that at the time we presented them, they were somewhat suspicious of some of our recommendations. But in the subsequent 3 years since we did this work, there have been many, many happy results as a result of this. Okay, the second and third ones I'll touch on a little more length in my remaining 8 minutes. So if we get the next slide, please. Okay, this is a project that we did about a year ago. And this we did for the state of Wisconsin, as well as a couple other entities. This is the state where I live. The state of Wisconsin is about, I want to say 6 million people right now, or thereabouts. It has some fairly sizable cities. The city of Milwaukee is a significant city. The city of Madison is a significant city. Many hundreds of thousands of people. And what we were asked to identify by the state is, can we figure out which businesses in Wisconsin might be able to participate in the production of solar panels or windmills? And not necessarily windmills, wind turbines, I should say. Not necessarily the entire turbine itself or the solar panel, but components of it. The recognition here is that the costs associated with production in both of these areas of energy production are changing rapidly, and that leaders in the state wanted to make sure that our local firms were capable of grabbing onto these changing markets as quickly as possible and could identify upstream and downstream supply chain partners. And so again, this was a great case that we took, I think I had about a dozen students on this one. So how we did this is we first identified, we worked with physicists. So we worked with a team of physicists to identify all the components of these wind turbines as well as solar panels. We then identified all the North American Industrial Classification System codes that were associated with the businesses producing these components. So this is census data, US Census data now. We then were able to procure a proprietary data set listing all the NAICS codes as well as individual business names. And we were able to identify over 100 Wisconsin businesses that could potentially produce these items if there was slight changes in the cost structure associated with those markets. So what did students learn in that exercise? They learned how to use US Census data. They learned how to apply the North American Industrial Classification System, which the rest of the world uses International Standard Industrial Classification, ISIC. So students learned how to identify that. They learned how to construct a simple report on economic ideas. And this work was then disseminated to those 100 plus Wisconsin businesses across the state. This generated a lot of interest when we first did it. And again, I'm happy to say that it seems to generate interest from time and time again. In fact, earlier this evening, I was at an event with some political candidates, and they were very interested in receiving a copy of this report. Right. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so here's some of the specific learning goals. So again, trying to map these ideas to what we're trying to do. So make sure that we're not sort of throwing out all the good stuff of standard economics, and then by just sort of wedging all this other stuff in here. So when we went through this, I'm laying out to students, okay, here's what we're going to learn when we do this. We're going to learn how to use large data sets. We're going to learn how to use the US Census webpage, which might be the biggest web page in the world. I don't know if you ever use the US Census page, but it's pretty ridiculous. We're going to learn how the industrial classification system works. We're going to learn how BLS industry datasets works, and so on. Okay. You are going to learn in doing this, you're going to learn advanced Microsoft Excel skills, you're going to learn professional writing skills, you're going to learn data presentations, as well as you're going to learn soft skills. The students had to go out and present this work to various community partners. Hopefully gain some institutional awareness about how we present the things that we do as economists, because I believe it was Keynes who said something along the lines of, the economist has to be a professional philosopher, mathematician, as well as a politician. And those are important skills, I think, for our students to understand too, that sometimes the results that we arrive at as economists have to be approached in a very subtle manner when we speak to the public that are going to be impacted by those policies and ideas. Which brings me to the next presentation, next slide, where this became very apparent. So in my last, it looks like we've got 4 minutes left here. The last study I want to talk about a little bit, this was done a few years ago. We were approached by it's complicated, let's just say a state environmental agency, as well as some of the Native American population that we have here in the United States, and particularly in Wisconsin. And they were concerned about a lot of damage that was occurring to the many lakes that we have here in the area. And so we were asked to ascertain the impact of damages to lake, particularly algae, on home prices. And so this was a rather straightforward hedonic application. You can see the data set was quite small because this is, first of all, this was several years ago now, but also, well, it's a long story. But again, brought students along with this. So I had about another dozen students on this. This is another class where we ran this project and arrived at some results. Next slide, please. So in that case, we arrived at the fairly, can I go back? Can I go back a slide? All right, thank you. So in this case, right, in this case, it was a really nice application because we were able to go up and talk to members of the tribal councils. We were able to demonstrate to them the sort of value of, they believed, right? So they had a strong passion for this natural environment. They, really, there were a lot of strong feelings about this. And so we were able to come to them and tell them, okay, look, here's what we estimate the value of this water to be in terms of its water clarity. Here's exactly what you can expect sort of the damages to be if said damages should occur. And perhaps most importantly, we were able to go to state legislators and demonstrate to them that, well, this thing we call the environment, if we damage it, it lowers property values. And if we lower property values, that lowers property taxes, which means less income back to the state. And so we were able to build a real strong constituency for the maintenance of this water quality and water clarity. Again, touching on the learning goals in here, we can see what they are: construct and analyze large data sets, evaluate the literature in this area. Of course, students had to do a lit review of the, there's a huge literature on this, right? Application of hedonic models to various water issues. They design the econometric model, apply econometric methods, and of course they learned a set of skills associated with those as well. We were able to use a couple different statistical packages, so they gained familiar with those. They were doing applied econometrics with actual data sets. They're learning professional writing and of course soft skills too. Presenting to a set of folks that a lot of college students wouldn't normally present to: tribal councils, other community leaders in very remote and rural areas. It was definitely a learning experience for a lot of students. Okay, I apologize, I've gone a little bit over time, but if I could just go to the next slide, then I kind of want to start wrapping this up. So at this point, as I mentioned, I'm kind of 12 years into this project of sort of trying to integrate this stuff into the economics curriculum. And I've got an anecdotally, pretty good idea that this does lead to superior student outcomes. At least that's what my graduates from, 5-10 years ago tell me. Generally, it looks pretty good, but I don't know that in a scientific sense. And I'm very interested in a conversation about how we measure student outcomes. How do we know when we're actually doing better by our students? Is it GPA? Is it time to graduation? Is it work placement rate? Is it work satisfaction? Is it student satisfaction? I'm not sure. I tend to prefer things like 5 years out from graduation, but these are difficult things to measure. So I'm really looking, if you're sympathetic to sort of what I'm trying to do here in terms of this, or if you've worked on these sort of, wrestled with these ideas yourself, I'm really interested to hear what people sort of think about how we might measure these things. And then finally, how do we really standardize a curriculum that is, by its nature, idiosyncratic? So these projects that I mentioned, they were all done for a constituency at a given time at the bequest of the constituency. So they won't be replicated because they're now done, right? And we'll be moving on to the next thing. I'm actually currently in the middle of another one of these projects right now that I'll be happy to talk about if folks have questions, but that project also hopefully won't be done again. So how do we create a standard curriculum out of these sort of events? I'm unsure, but I'm very hopeful because it does seem to be a good thing. It does seem to be improving student interest in economics, at least as far as I can observe. And it keeps me interested in doing these things too. So with that, I'll guess I'll turn it over to whoever's in charge of managing questions, and I look forward to a lively discussion. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tom. That was really a very interesting presentation, and I'm sure Faculty of Economics at our department and those outside of Ateneo would have learned a thing or two from your presentation this morning. And I also hope to hear feedback from students who are in the Zoom audience this morning, because they are the consumer of this good, the so-called economics of education. Okay, but before we entertain questions, let me just acknowledge our Dean, the School of Social Sciences, Dean Bop Saloma, who is in the audience, but I think she already left for another meeting. We also have Jim Acevedo, Loyola School's Faculty Social Involvement Coordinator, who is present this morning. Okay, so at this point, I'm sure some of our audience would like to ask questions. So please raise your hand, or you may just unmute and show yourself. Anybody? Okay, let me just check the audience. Anybody who has questions? Okay, Randy, the Department Chair of Economics.
Oh, ito. I think if it's okay, I'll make the first crack at the question.
Yes,
so, and then maybe the others can chime in. I'm sure that many of our faculty have questions. My questions actually focus on if partnerships were developed with local firms or state agencies in producing the reports, or were you did those two reports that you mentioned towards the end of your presentation, the one on the manufacturing report and the report, or did you just actually went ahead with the project and then just informed these agencies and afterwards that you had this project? So well, my question really is, were you also attempting some sort of ownership of this report by your local partners, or was it just a report that I mean, this reports could really help, no, the knowledge, no, of your student or skills of your students.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, it's a good question. So these relationships are often quite complicated, and every one of these projects is different. So in the case of that project, that was a statewide sort of think tank, takes proposals, right? And I'll be honest, I don't remember how the proposal came about. We wrote the proposal, so myself and a colleague from the Department of Physics and Material Sciences, and this think tank liked the project, and so they funded the grant, and then we proceeded to do the work. That work then was distributed to the state, so state leaders, as well as to all the firms that were identified in the report. So the firms themselves weren't partners during the study. Some of them have contacted me afterwards and have become, we have a relationship now, but the original work was done effectively by a statewide think tank. So a policy group. Yeah. Some of the other ones, like the water one, I did a whole bunch of those studies, and that was one of those things where originally a lakes group approached me and they said, knowing that I was an economist and knowing that I'd done a lot of this type of work, and asked me if I could do that. And then it just became one after the other, right? We ended up doing 4 studies like that for different areas around the state and for different types of specific questions. So in that case, the end recipient of the information was the specific client that wanted the work done. And so that is kind of, that's frankly my goal. That's my preferred way to do this, is that it run it almost as like a little consulting group, because the students really like that. In my experience, they really like that they're it's not a theoretical issue, right? I mean, we're using theory, right? So that's why I'm being careful with how I'm saying it, right? We're using theory, but it's not a hypothetical situation. It's a real situation, and the results that they produce are going to, they're going to be out there. Now, I'll also share a challenge with that too. Somebody will probably ask this, but this can be real tricky, because sometimes students' work isn't maybe up to where we would want a professional consulting to be, right? So this has to usually be kind of upfront with whoever I'm working with, right? That okay, well, understand what we're doing here. Understand that we're bringing students in here that are new to this, that they'll be working under my guidance and sometimes under other faculty members' guidance, but these are still students, and we need to recognize it. And honestly, it's been okay, right? It's been pretty good. People have been very understanding by and large of that. I'm going to make sure the numbers are right at the end of the day, but sometimes typos miss my eye a little bit and they get stuck in reports and left there, but yeah.
Okay, so yeah, thank you. Yeah, maybe you can give chance to the others. Yeah, but I think you raised important points on the evaluation also as well. So, but thank you for your responses about the partnerships and the issues that you raised.
Okay, thanks, Randy. Anybody else has a comment or question? Yes, Gregory, you can unmute yourself and ask the question yourself.
Hello everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Ayan. Good day, Professor Thomas. So my question is regarding the green manufacturing economy. Can you share to us what are the tools you use during evaluating the market conditions?
Oh, are you referring to the project that I went over a short while ago? Yeah.
Yes, Professor.
Yeah. So that's a good question. We didn't evaluate the market conditions. Our task was simply to identify firms that could participate in alternative forms of manufacturing if market conditions changed a little bit. So the thinking was, well, I shouldn't say the thinking. What the learning objective here was to teach students how to identify businesses that are operating in a given sector, and then how those businesses' production techniques might be altered somewhat to produce different types of technologies. So for example, today we're producing, one of the firms in question produces parts for automobiles, cranks for windows, all this sort of interior pieces. And they could be shifted to produce a lot of the smaller components for solar cells, which share similar properties. So the exercise wasn't so much in determining market structure or market conditions in that case. It was to determine the sort of nature of production that it was occurring and alternative forms of production that could be employed by those firms. Interestingly, this has become, that was the original work, was the sort of green energy thing, but the work has become more noticed because of COVID, actually. So we think about things like production of PPE, production of vaccines, production of transportation of vaccines, the entire logistics supply chain associated with mitigating COVID. Of course, virtually none of that structure existed prior to COVID. So the economics question with regards to COVID becomes, how can we utilize existing production methods, existing firms, existing technologies to mass produce things like vaccines, to get vaccines to locations where they need to go to administer those vaccines to individuals. Much like moving from a peacetime footing to a wartime footing, say World War II style situation or any other large conflict. And so that was the exercise the students were engaged in there, is how we identify those specific production areas and then how those production areas can be shifted to others. So it was really an exercise in understanding the industrial classification system very well, which of course was why that system was created back in the day, right? Is lead up to World War II. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor. That's all, ma'am.
It's a great question. Thank you for listening to me talk about this stuff this morning. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So any other questions? So before we call on the next one, actually, Tom, when you sent us the topic of your seminar, I was really thinking that this really highlights the importance of faculty to be engaged in research, and in this particular case, applied research work, so that it can be integrated in their teaching and more so in the curriculum. So in your experience, because you're the department chair, I am assuming that you also encourage your faculty to do this because you yourself are doing this. So how did you do that in your department?
Well, some people, okay, so a department chair's authority is extremely limited, as I'm sure you're, I'm sure as Randy will chime in. I think that most of my faculty are really on board with this idea. I don't think I know that. I know that. Some of them are more hesitant to make alterations to curriculum, right? And for good reason, right? For good reason. A lot, and that's why I started this presentation with this sort of maybe very sort of dry, talk about what we do, right? But there's a lot of really valuable, good stuff in that. And so some folks I think are a little hesitant to move away from that. And the other thing I'll say too is that, and some of them are rightly hesitant, and I am too, is that sometimes these things don't work out too well. The stories that I told today are all relatively happy stories that turned out relatively well. But I'll just do a quick one. This was one of the earlier ones. It's kind of a learning lesson. Is I was asked by a regional economic development authority to do some economic impact analysis. And so we did that with a group of students, and the numbers came back, and it was clear that that if this firm that was coming in, it was going to drive other firms out of business. There was no way that the number of firms and the total supply was justifiable given the market. And so, I knew that their business plan had to be to drive existing firms out of business. And that's not an easy thing to tell people. And that wasn't an easy thing to explain to my students how we're going to say this story too. And that can be rough, right? That can be rough in an educational environment, particularly if you have a large class. Fortunately, in that case, it was just a small select group of students that I had. And so they'd work with me on a number of projects. But the stories aren't always happy when you're dealing with reality. Sometimes things can't be fixed, or the results that you get aren't okay, right? They suggest
exactly.
Unhappy things. Yeah.
Exactly. So I guess students would also need to hear that, right? Because it's not all rosy out there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Let me just call one of the students. I think maybe it would also be good to hear from one of the students, Marla, and then I'll be calling Dino, who has a question for the last question. Marla Torres, are you there?
Hi, ma'am. Hi.
Okay.
Hi, sir. So this question has been raised already in some dialogue between the Econ department and students from the Ateneo Economics Association before. So we'd like to ask for suggestions on how the curriculum could properly integrate mathematics, economics, and fieldwork, because it's been pretty challenging for our batch to integrate these fields, especially for our capstone or thesis project. So right now, taking our thesis, we encountered lots of complex mathematics and even econometric models that we've never encountered before in our past classes, and sometimes even the simple OLS models, they don't just work. So do you have any suggestions for that integration issue?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I mean, I'm teaching econometrics now, actually, and amongst a few other things. But yeah, we just use. I don't. We do some time series stuff using stuff beyond OLS, but for the most part, I just focus on OLS style regression analysis for the undergraduate level. And truth be told, you know, that gets you most of the way you need to go, at least in my experience, in a lot of practical applications. So it's kind of what your goal is. I think I think Ateneo is a little bit different school than where I'm teaching. We have very few students who go on to graduate work in economics from my institution, maybe 10% of the population. And so if I had students who were if I knew were going on to graduate work, then I know they're going to get more of this work in graduate school. And I'm probably going to make sure they take more math courses. And I'm not going to try to integrate as much of this applied work in for them as I might for somebody who maybe just wanted to do a master's degree or particularly just a bachelor's degree. The math training is going to be absolutely critical for a student's survival in say, a PhD program. And to not take the time to carefully prepare a student for that would probably not be a good idea, I don't think, and would not serve them well. So I think you have to do what we do as economists and measure costs and benefits. And for students that the costs exceed the benefits to integrate additional things, you don't do it. Now, I will say that many of the students that I've worked with on these types of projects, they have gone on to graduate school. Some of them become PhDs in time, and they've still found it useful to do this additional work. And I'll be honest, as a chair, right, oftentimes I'll write substitutions for students to take different courses than might normally be required for them as an econ major. So for example, if I have a particularly bright student who I know is going to go on to graduate work, I'm going to let them take more math classes. I'm going to encourage them to do applied work, but then I'm not going to require them to do as many maybe field courses as they would normally do in an undergraduate major. So if they've taken like international trade and finance, if they've done like labor or money and banking, you know, they don't need to do any more of that sort of applications of either macro or microeconomic theory. Because if you've done it a couple times, you've got a pretty good handle on how you're going to do it the rest of the time. And so that's where I'm going to cut, right? That's where I'm going to cut is a little bit out of those sort of field applications of theory for that type of student.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Marla. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think Dino has the same question. So Dino, is it okay if I already skip you? I think Thomas has already answered your question.
My question was similar to Marla's.
Yeah, okay. So thank you, Dino. So can we go to the next two because it's already late at Wisconsin. I don't want to keep on.
So it's okay. It's okay.
So we have two more, Wendeline and then Jacob. Wendeline, can you ask your question yourself? You may unmute. Wendeline, are you there? Okay, I'll ask the question. So in today's era, more schools opening the economic course with the fact that the school is not yet fully geared to do. The question is, how do we know if the school we enrolled in is ready to teach the economic course? If the school is not yet ready, what will happen to the student? Is there any possible way to improve and expand the learnings of the student in the Philippines? That's her question.
Well, that's a very big question.
You can answer.
I have to say, I don't have enough experience with the educational system in the Philippines to answer that question, that part of that question. If you're trying to figure out whether a given program is of sufficient quality to justify whatever expenditures you plan to lay out on it, right? I would encourage yourself or any interested students speak to graduates of that program, right? That's what I do with our own prospective students. Is I'm more than happy to give them names of students, and I would encourage any student to do something similar. If you talk to somebody who's 5-10 years out of a program, they're going to be able to give you a real honest opinion about whether they received a quality education from that program. That's a real hard thing to ascertain when you're just going in, right? Because you don't know economics, or you wouldn't be going to study economics, right? So how do you ascertain, right? It's a recursion problem, right? How do you ascertain a high quality program? Speak to people who've been through it, right? Speak to people who've been through it.
Okay. I think Jacob here doesn't have a question, but a comment. The IS International Studies Economics is a part of IS. So as an IS student, International Studies Association have done research about the particular subject. So I guess there are also similar work being done here in the Philippines. I think that's about it for the Q&A. Unless anybody has a burning question, because it's already 11:08 time check. It's already 10 o'clock, past 10 o'clock at Wisconsin.
Hey, it's an honor to be with you all. So really, it's okay. Don't worry about it. You know, it's an honor to be asked to be doing this, and it's an honor to be, speaking to that folks halfway around the world want to, listen to an economics professor talk about the teaching of economics. So
We'll hear more from you when you get here, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully. Okay. So at this point, I'd like to invite everyone to turn on their camera so we can have our photo opportunity with the speaker, the much awaited event of the seminar. But as you are trying to fix your hair and your smiles, let me just invite you to the next seminar, which is going to be on April 27. So this will be after the Holy Week. So our speaker is Professor Asad Islam from Monash University, and he will be talking about conducting randomized controlled trials in developing countries, lessons and practices. And as always, most of our economic seminars are available in our YouTube channel, and we have a playlist for this seminar in the Ateneo University YouTube channel. Okay, and